The third perspective on the question of why that I would like to introduce has to do with the intersections or the relations between human rights and other primary objectives of the international community. I'd like you to think first about the image of a triangle. When the United Nations was formed, it was clear from the outset that a primary objective had to do with ensuring peace and security in the world in the future. This, of course, is also manifest in the form of the UN Security Council, which is one of the most powerful and important organs of the entire organization. Another primary objective of the United Nations was to facilitate global prosperity. And this is linked with the idea of development, economic development and social development. Institutionally, this in turn is reflected in another primary body of the United Nations, the council called ECOSOC, the ECOSOC Council. Now, these two primary objectives, which we can put at the top two corners of the triangle, clearly interact in a positive way, potentially, with one another. The more we can ensure peace and security in the world, the more there's a chance for societies and peoples to prosper, not to invest in destructive technologies, not to invest in warfare, rather to invest in production, development of society, development of people, development of the economy to the benefit of all. And conversely, a prosperous global economy, a prosperous world, is less likely to engage in hostility and armed conflict. So one can say that peace, security on the one side, inclusive prosperity and development on the other side, or maybe one could say equitable economic development on the other side, enter into a synergistic relationship with one another. They mutually reinforce one another. The third angle of the triangle should be associated with the notion of human rights. So from the outset, the international community felt that in order to develop a world order reinforcing peace, security, prosperity and development, one needed to also ensure protection of human rights as a common objective of the entire international community and of all member states. This is maybe slightly less obvious, but it was felt that totalitarian regimes were characterized precisely by the abuse of human rights and at the same time were a profoundly destabilizing factor in the international world order. So if human rights, and in a wider sense maybe democratic governance, could be ensured in member states, it was likely that the world order would be able to realize the aspiration of prosperity, peace and security. So, in the decades that have followed, it's been a central challenge for human rights advocates to demonstrate that there's synergies in all axes of the triangle, not only between peace and security and economic prosperity, but also between human rights and peace and security. So the more we protect human rights, the more we'll be able to maintain peaceful and secure societies, and the more we protect human rights, the more people will enjoy economic prosperity and social development. That's the core idea. This even comes to the point where the concepts of peace and security and development are being assimilated to the human rights norm, to factoring in a human rights aspect, such that we think of security as human security and development as human development, not just economic development measured in euros or dollars, but rather in development of people, of the capabilities of people, the ability to realize oneself and one's aspirations for a good life. Similarly, security, not just as a way for society to protect its border, to protect itself from external hostilities and transgressions, but for people in society to live fulfilling and secure lives in respect of their inherent human rights. This is the objective. As we said, that is projected as a new beginning following the end of the Second World War, and that has been revisited at crucial moments in the 7.5 decades that have followed. Now, if one visualizes this kind of a triangle, one can also, in fact, see where certain expressions of human rights skepticism enter into the picture. For example, in the relationship between peace, security, and human rights, there are people who think these are not always compatible with one another. The relationship is not always synergistic. Sometimes it's argued you get more security by disregarding human rights standards. We associate this with the notion of securitization. This is a phenomenon one sees in most, if not all, parts of the world. Certain transgressions of rights to privacy are being justified in the name of anti-terrorism, for example. Even harsh interrogation techniques, in fact torture, have been justified as ways of keeping Western society secure, American society secure, in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks on the Twin Towers in New York. There are many other examples of this kind of disjuncture between human rights and peace and security. And from the point of view of the human rights champion, a human rights advocate, our challenge is to continue to show that one can attain as good or better protection of social stability, peace and security by complying with human rights standards than by disregarding them. But that's a continuous challenge. It's the way in which it's a continuous work in progress to maintain the credibility and viability of the international human rights architecture. Same thing can be said exactly about the relationship between economic prosperity and human rights. There are many good examples for how a human rights approach, a human rights-based approach to development can be mobilized to enhance economic prosperity in parts of the world that have been seen to be underdeveloped or underprivileged. But there are continuously political leaders entering into the picture who want to say, no, we can develop society more aggressively, we can develop the economy more aggressively by not worrying so much about certain labor rights, right to manifest dissent in the political sphere, freedom of expression, and all sorts of other nuisances that in fact hinder our ability to develop the economy. So we prioritize the economic development, and then later we can start to worry about compliance with human rights standards. That's in blatant contradiction to the idea of a human rights-based approach to development, but it's nevertheless a way of thinking that has quite some traction or credibility in many parts of the world, and that is especially manifested in populist movements in many places, and that the human rights defenders need to take seriously and try to rise to, always in concrete situation-specific manners. If we were to try to summarize these latter expressions of human rights skepticism in a nutshell, one could perhaps say that it's being suggested that human rights constitute a luxury that society cannot afford or cannot fully afford at the current moment in time. They have to be temporarily at least set aside in pursuit of other objectives which are seen to be overriding and more important. The response has to be to show, in one way or another, that society cannot afford to disregard human rights protection, because it will steer society in a wrong direction and ultimately undermine the overriding objectives. In conclusion of this short introduction, I'd like to introduce one last thought, present one more perspective on international human rights. This is not about why rights are important, where they come from, or how they align with existing cultural and religious value systems. It's about how human rights are being operationalized, and in particular, how the reference to human rights positions different actors vis-à-vis one another. I sometimes speak of this as a question of discursive positioning, or implied status in human rights practice. We all know how irritating it can feel to encounter someone who seemingly knows it all and feels called upon to lecture everyone on what they ought to do, what is right and wrong in a given situation. This comes across as arrogant, condescending, and disrespectful. Human rights advocates stand in danger of being perceived in this way, precisely, perhaps, due to their fervent commitment to the underlying cause. Unintentionally, the reference to authoritative human rights standards may position the interlocutor in an inferior position as someone who is being lectured to, told what to do, or at least so it appears. This has been a characteristic problem, sometimes, in North-South interactions, where representatives of the Global South, typically underprivileged, sometimes subject to many historical human rights abuses, are now being told by their more affluent, comfortable, powerful counterparts from the North what they should do, in particular with regard to improving their record of compliance with international human rights standards. Not only does this seem like a one-way communication, and in that sense as something a bit arrogant and condescending, it also seems as a matter of not respecting the other as capable of managing their own affairs. It's an unwelcome interference with the exercise of domestic sovereignty, and in that sense even may be perceived to be a continuation of the legacy of colonial rule, now in a neo-colonial variation. The human rights normative framework is sometimes associated with this. We should be quite uncomfortable about that. One can point to a somewhat similar dynamic at domestic level, or between actors at domestic level, albeit in a somewhat different version. In European societies, we are witnessing a rising backlash against so-called expert cultures. And human rights experts are being associated with this, or human rights advocates are being associated with this. Elected politicians sometimes point to self-proclaimed human rights experts and ask, who are they? Who are they to tell us what is right and wrong, what we can and cannot do in the exercise of the mandate given to us by the people? Judges are sometimes accused of judicial overreach, interfering illegitimately with the political process. And it's even worse if the voice of the human rights advocate comes from outside the country itself, from representatives of institutions, international institutions, be it the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg, or human rights bodies of the United Nations in Geneva and New York. This is seen to be an unwelcome, arrogant interference with the exercise of domestic affairs. Brexit is an example of where that could lead to when the frustration builds. It's my sense that many expressions of human rights skepticism, as introduced along the way, for example, the criticism that the human rights framework supports values that are out of sync with existing cultural values, or disagreements about how to align different social priorities. Such expressions of human rights skepticism usually contain, at a deeper level, also a frustration with this kind of question of discursive positioning, of how human rights are being invoked and where that positions actors vis-a-vis one another. The frustration with being talked down to. This is a complex problem with no simple solution or answer. As a minimum, we need to recognize it and keep it in mind. We need to remind ourselves that human rights essentially are about empowerment, inclusiveness, giving voice to others even when we don't fully agree. In advancing the human rights agenda in the contemporary era, it's essential from time to time to reconnect with the underlying impetus, to revisit the sources and origins of international human rights and rediscover a sense of common purpose. In a world of increasing polarization, divisions, inequality, this is as important as ever.